today is Educational Life Forms. If this works, it does. Deleuzian Teaching and Learning Practice. Same title as the book I've just published on the same topic. So it's a philosophy of education talk today. Okay? So the first slide is the cover of the book. Good thing about these Sense publishers in Rotterdam, they allow you to choose the cover that you use for your book. And that's why I chose this one. This is a Swiss artist, picture called Life Forms. Why I chose that, what I didn't want was a teacher and some pupils sitting in the classroom dutifully doing their work. What I like about this is, from the start you get the impression it's new life forms. It's not human forms, it's life. So it's broader, it's more intense, it should be something different than the average just teacher and pupil type of book, even though it's philosophy of education. So in contrast to some books where the publishers they impose on you their stock picture of students enjoying their lecture, or a lecturer with their twinkle in their eyes, something like that, I could choose this, and so that's it indicates my intentions in writing the book to try and get further just from a very humanised idea of education, trying to get into this idea of new life forms. With that in mind, in the introduction, I kind of play with the reader a little bit. Instead of talking endlessly about education, I have this idea of machines. It's from Deleuze, Guattari, and synthesis. So I picked up on bacteria and hurricanes. And I think, well, let's imagine a new machine, something in the world that doesn't exist now, a bacteria hurricane machine. Something new, it's something different. It's got a different kind of energy feel about it. So we're not being immersed in this deep scholasticism about Deleuze. We're using Deleuze, we're using these ideas to come up with new machines, new forms. This gets you closer to understanding what an educational life form is about. It's not something dead, it's not something tired, hopefully, not something cliched. Should be something that makes something different happen in the world. And it can be, you can be as creative as you like, be as imaginative as you want. So in the introduction I introduced this idea of machines, bacteria hurricane machine. What would it look like? What would it feel like? What would it do if a bacteria hurricane machine existed? Again, in the introduction, I try and lay out the terrain for the whole book. I can't go into everything in the book today, but it's like a map or a diagram Deleuze talks about a lot. So this should explain a little bit what the teaching and learning practice is about. So on this axis, we have unconscious ideas here: relational pedagogy, affect, and the educational unconscious, including desire. So we want desire, unconscious, affect to be included in the way we teach. How we build relationships with our students, what we mean by education, has to have this unconscious axis. Very important. On the rational side, I've called it a practice theory and a community learning theory, constructivism. Education, I'll say constructivism is probably the most common theoretical stance that people take on education. You have to be careful what you mean exactly by constructivism. If you're taking it from Deleuze, Deleuze talks about constructivism in his book on Deleuze. It's not anthropomorphic, Deweyan type of constructivism. So human beings aren't constructing the knowledge all the time. It's constructivism of different forms. It's just making, it's doing, producing. So it's like all these little machines, creating communities, creating assemblages, not necessarily human, though humans aren't excluded. We're all humans, we're all here, we can use Deleuze, we can do stuff with it as well. So I want a community learning theory, but also a practice theory. Again, practice theory, I think taking Deleuze as a practice theorist is quite new, quite different. So I explained that in the introduction. It's not Heideggerian, it's not Wittgensteinian. A lot of practice theorists use Wittgenstein and Heidegger. I'm using Deleuze. They say in Thousand Plateaus, we can all botch the body with our organs. We can all, do it badly. We can do the philosophy badly. Of course we can. We can just reproduce dominant social forms. It's easy to do that. But you have to practice. You have to. It takes time. Often when you're theorizing, when you're using it, when you're teaching, using Deleuze, it can come out wrong, it can come out too quickly. So you have to think about it, you have to sort of step back a bit and really analyze it. And that's part of the practice theory of what I'm talking about in this book. So they're the main axes of the teaching and learning practice. Around it are the other parts which I'll touch on today. It's about space, another space. It's about life forms. It's about the virtual, which is associated with time, and about epiphanies. Epiphanies I'm sort of imposing on Deleuze a little bit, but if you think about it, the way the examples he uses often to exemplify his ideas taken from literature, this implies a type of epiphany theory. Okay, so that's the introduction, the kind of overview. Now we get to how I've characterized his philosophy in the book. I've characterized it as a philosophy of life. And this is the big quote, a famous quote from one of his later. I'm not going to read all of the quotes that I've got on the PowerPoint today, but I think this one is a big one, so it should be read. A life. No one has described what a life is better than Charles Dickens. We take the indefinite article as an index of the transcendental. A disreputable man, a rogue, held in contempt by everyone, is found dying. Suddenly, those taking care of him manifest an eagerness, respect, even love for his slightest sign of life. Everyone bustles about to save him, to the point where in his deepest coma, this wicked man himself senses something soft and sweet penetrating him. But to the degree that he comes back to life, his saviours turn colder. He becomes once again mean and crude. Between his life and his death, there is a moment that is only that of a life playing with death. This is from one of Deleuze's last published pieces, Immanence of Life, it's called. First point, obviously, notice the A life, it's a life. It's indefinite, so it's not, philosophy of life isn't all life, it isn't pro-life, it isn't human life, and it's a life. You get to this level, again here, he explains it towards them, between his life and his death, there is a moment that is only that of a life playing with death. So you've got this character, this brilliant character in Dickens, comes back to life, but what you see, what's the important thing is you see the movement in affect, you see the movement in the way people treat him. So there's a bit where he's not this mean character, but he's not someone new, he's a life, he's in between life and death, he's that moment of difference. That's what we're aiming at with a philosophy of life. We're trying to get there. As I said, practice theory is not always easy, especially in education where things are kind of quite normatively bound. So to get to that point of a life between, sides, you have to push, you have to try, you have to think about it a lot, you have to kind of step back and, really work on it. So again, this is what I want to signal through philosophy of life. Okay? So after that, I've discussed that quote, then I go into the philosophical background of a philosophy of life. I've picked out 4 main philosophers. Again, I'm not kind of doing a apprenticeship of philosophy type of thing here with Deleuze, saying you've got to understand everything about Bergson and to understand what Deleuze was on about, but to understand what philosophy of life is, I think you do have to take into account the 4 biggest influences, as I see it, on Deleuze's work. Okay? So first one, Bergson. Bergson's a very interesting character. The fact that Deleuze used and looked at Bergson so much, I think it says something about Deleuze's character, what Deleuze wanted to do. Because Bergson at the time was extremely popular. The turn of the century, he was probably the world's #1 intellectual. He started the first known traffic jam, I used this in my talk the other day, was caused by him giving a talk in New York. So Bergson was a really big, popular academic, and his idea of vitalism, was kind of the norm. But then it was vilified, and it was hated by the French and by the British alike, and so it became, he's kind of become a forgotten figure almost. So what Deleuze wants to do in his book called Bergsonism in the 1960s is try and, get back to the real Bergson, get back to what people found exciting and interesting about Bergson, his vitalism. Interestingly for education, a lot of the alternative modes of education are kind of deschooling and approaches which focus on learning and not the institutional parts of education, they use Bergson and this idea of vitalism. So, interesting sort of contrast there. So here in these quotes, he's talking about applying tests of true and false on themselves, condemning false problems, reconcile truth, creation level of problems, struggling against illusion, rediscover the true differences in kinds, kind of key term for Deleuze. He talks about this a lot, especially in difference repetition. Articulations of the real is only that which is cut according to natural articulation of differences. State problems and solve them in terms of time rather than space. So it's taking from Bergson the philosophical ideas of his vitalism and trying to make them relevant, make them come alive, as it were, for today's audience. Especially this restating ideas instead of time, but also looking at truth, looking at what a problem is. You can see how he's working against phenomenology and bits of Kant there as well. So it's all up in the air. It's all kind of at play with Bergson for Deleuze. And it's an important part of what he means by a philosophy of life, or what I would say he means. Next one is Karl Marx. When I gave this talk the other day in London, a lot of people say Deleuze wasn't a Marxian. What are you talking about, sort of thing? Apparently he was working on his last book that he didn't ever publish was called The Greatness of Marx. Felix Guattari was a Marxist. In the 1970s in French academia, Marx was, I think, the biggest influence for many of the philosophers. And what it does, this is just a diagram. I got this from the Industrial Union, 1912. What it does, what it helps you to think about is, where are we? When we're talking about philosophy of life, we're applying it to education, we're trying to use it in the world. We're here, down here. We're in this, the bottom strata, as it were. We're not, as a lecturer, as someone in society, as a teacher. Sometimes you can sort of kid yourself. You're up here somewhere, or you're somehow important. There's some sort of authoritarian sort of way in which you're giving this philosophy of life to people, you're imposing it. Of course we're not. I think what having Marx as one of the bases for the philosophy of life is a social philosophy. It's about change, about making changes in society, helping with those changes, and it is based on analysing composites and ideas from this perspective. It's not up here. It's not rarefied. It's not full of capital and power and money. Okay, so Marx, second influence. Third one, Spinoza. Deleuze wrote books on Spinoza. This comes from Brian Massumi's use of Deleuze and Spinoza and affect. Affect here is going around this string theory. On this side you've got affections. It's interesting, isn't it? We always kind of put affections on the left and then potentia on the right. There's a sort of political almost sort of positioning here. Agency is in the middle. This goes through all of Deleuze's writing. I think Spinoza, one of the biggest influences on him and his writing about life and about how things happen in the world. Another way of looking at it is the affectio and affectus and agency, but again I think that misses out the potentia. So I think I like the affect being kind of a string theory and having this potentia, this sort of future orientation as well to it. So it's kind of a little bit more balanced than just a sort of dualism between being affected and affecting, which is a sort of slogan some people pick up from Spinoza. So I like that. It's Brian Masumi writes really eloquently about Spinoza and Deleuze. Third influence. Last philosophical influence then on the philosophy of life is Nietzsche. Again, Deleuze never sort of tired from quoting Nietzsche, using Nietzsche in his own work. Again, some people can misunderstand that. Some people think that it's all sort of about will to power, or it's not. If you read Nietzsche and you really see the way in which Deleuze is taking Nietzsche and using Nietzsche, here, and it shows it here. It's about thinking. This is why I've included this quote from. This is from Deleuze's early book on Nietzsche and philosophy. It's what is thinking. What is the life of a thinker? It's it's much invention, reflection, boldness, despair, and hope. And voyages of great navigators. And tell the truth, there are also voyages of exploration in the most distant and perilous domains of life. What is surprising is life, the two opposed instincts which pull in opposite directions seem to be forced to walk under the same yoke. The instinct leads to knowledge, is constantly constrained to abandon the ground where man habitually lives and to throw itself into the uncertain. And the instinct that wills life is forced to grope ceaselessly in the dark for a new place to establish itself. So it's about the turmoil, it's about the lack of knowledge in many ways. The uncertainty, the fear. Again, you can see there's affect in here. There are many things inside Deleuze's idea of life, which he takes from Nietzsche, which gets back to instinct, gets back to how instincts work when you think, when you have an idea, when you actually use philosophy in the world and for a purpose, which I'm trying to do here for educational life forms. Okay, so they're the 4 influences. But in the book, I didn't want to just write a philosophy book. This is kind of nice and comfortable to do that. So I wanted to actually apply it in the world. So the 3rd chapter is on educational life forms, of current systems, of things, trying to bring it up to date and make it use educational life forms to analyse what's going on now. This is a quote from Blanchard that is quite nice. It sort of shows the first part, the kind of the normativity bit. He said, the penal system, which goes from secrecy of torture and the spectacle of executions to the refined use of model prisons, in which some may acquire advanced university degrees while others resort to a contented life of tranquilizers, brings us back to the ambiguous demands and perverse constraints of progressivism that is, however, unavoidable and even beneficent. Okay? So it's, again, it can be the hardest part of using Deleuze's philosophy to actually sort of, to take it in the real world and to analyse what's going on. You can't deny in education that this normativity, this kind of reproduction of the normal goes on all the time. But what does having a Deleuzian philosophy of life, what does that tell us about it? Does it mean we all become strange or we become other to that? No, we live in that. That's what, I work as a university lecturer. Your students here, you're working in university, so we're not other than this form of normativity. What we can do, what the philosophy of life can help us with, we can recognise it, we can play with it, we can use it, we can write about it, we can subtly subvert it and undermine it if we want to. So it's kind of, it's doing something with it, doing something interesting. I think Blanchard, obviously other philosopher, thinker is Michel Foucault. He wrote about discipline and punishment. A lot of his ideas, I think, are parallel to Deleuze in terms of a social theory which, critiques systems. Next one, exams, similar to normativity. I like this quote from David Puntner, from 1980s. A lot of in education, a lot of the most interesting work in education I find comes from left field critical theorists or cultural theorists. He says, the substance reflects the form. This is not the arena for risk. Thus the examination produces that familiar double bind, lurking in the shadows of the image of the brilliant script, which is offered in terms not of a form of perfection, but a masterstroke, the single God-given answer which will convince there is a potential hero of a generation. But this, of course, is not really possible, however much candidates may brag afterwards, and thus the image of the perfect answer to the all-consuming question of the state is continually withheld, proffered but out of reach, confirming in advance the authority of the board, convincing the candidates that it's better to be safe than to take the risk of effects of which, after all, nobody will ever see. So, using Deleuze's philosophy of life, it doesn't say all exams are wrong. It doesn't say that we've got to dismantle the examination system in the UK or around the world or whatever, but it says, philosophy of life gives us this insight into the processes that are happening due to exams. A kind of common expression is, teaching to the test. So some teachers reduce the whole of education experience to just teaching to the test. That's all it's about for them. And why? Because there's pressure from parents, there's rankings, there's, the exams results are published and there's money involved with how well the kids do and all that sort of stuff. But what it does is reduce the experience of education to this narrow, it's just about exams. Obviously, in terms of philosophy of life, you're cutting out all these other possibilities. Okay, Tasmania. I worked in Tasmania for 4 years. It's just an anecdote to illustrate philosophy of life in the real world. Happened in Tasmania was they introduced a new curriculum based on constructivist principles about thinking, and they got rid of English and maths and geography and history and all the normal categories that we have in terms of the curriculum, in terms of knowledge. So they had this, they spent 13 years, they had focus groups, they retrained teachers, they spent millions and millions of dollars, Tasmania and this little island. And then what happened was parents didn't like it. parents didn't understand, especially when they came to assessment, because they weren't assessing maths and getting an A, or they had these different categories like being literate, or creating and pursuing goals, or being ethical. They had these weird titles for the subjects. Parents didn't understand it. They voted with their feet, and they voted against the minister who put this through. Okay, so it took them 13 years to establish this, millions of dollars. It took them 3 days to totally get rid of it, and it's consigned to the dustbin of educational experimentation and thought. So what does it tell us? It tells us that in terms of educational life forms, in terms of Deleuzian teaching and learning practice, it's all very well to create these brilliant ideas which we know will make a difference and be better for the kids and make better for us in education. But yet you have to be very careful against kind of moral backlashes. You have to make sure that, in a way, it's the way you do it isn't exposed to these external forces. These things like in a democracy where people vote against things they don't understand, they can't be bothered to do research, they didn't like it, so they voted against it. The government gets scared, and all your proposals, all the things you've done suddenly become irrelevant.
Isn't that a bit patronising?
To what?
Well, the people who revolted, isn't that a kind of, you're almost couching it in a value judgment on the parents. What you just kind of said that they vote because they don't understand what they're doing. What's the implication there?
The implication was that they hadn't been going along with it all along. Until it got to the time when they actually got the piece of paper in front of them which said things they didn't understand, didn't want to understand. I'm not value judging them. It's a fact of history what happened. So then they voted against it. The person.
But you've couched that as a kind of progressive agenda, and then all these parents come along and say, well, actually, we don't like it.
The way that the politicians against it, it was a Labour government, the politicians against it, they said no more experimentation with our education, no more things you don't understand. So it was a political argument at the time. I'm not saying parents are stupid. I'm not saying but in terms of what happened, they were affected by anti-essential. It was called essential learning, anti-essential learning's rhetoric. Which didn't really, a sensible, rational discussion wasn't had. It should have been, because these changes were actually really positive and really useful. It was kind of strange to me I was a lecturer there, in education, and I was asked to, give lectures on the essential learnings. I didn't design it. I wasn't pro or against it or anything like that. I was just caught up in the middle of this highly politicized exercise. Some teachers were really against it, and what it shows is that it's many of these in the kind of public policy and in these kind of hysteria. Well, a lot of these things are irrational. They're not. People don't sit down and have a lengthy, discussion about these things. If they had have done, they would have probably realised that they still do English and they still do maths and they still do science. They're just framing it in a different way through this curriculum. That wasn't discussed. So that's the point. Maybe, I shouldn't have said...
that's fair enough.
They didn't, it's... Because most people haven't got time as well. People haven't got time to sit down and really go through the ideas of constructivism. Of course they haven't. Everybody's working, they're trying to pay off their mortgage and go to work and cope with the kids and all, Anyway, could get distracted from it. But it shows us something about educational life forms as well, that it's... You have to couch it and use it and work with it in a certain way, as otherwise things can be taken away from you. Okay? All right, epiphanies. Epiphanies are something in the book. I write a chapter on epiphanies. I'm giving Deleuze epiphanies. I'm saying that this is sort of relevant and part of what he wants. Though he doesn't actually name them as epiphanies, but if you look at his examples, Proust, Joyce, literary examples, I would say that he's trying to actually encourage one as a thinker to have epiphanies throughout his oeuvre. So, this is just two definitions of epiphanies. I'm not taking either side. This is from James Joyce. It's a sudden spiritual manifestation. This is more kind of from Deleuzian. He's a qualitative analyst. He's more, interactional moments, experiences which leave marks on people's lives. Personal, it's a kind of a sensible, slower idea. argues there are 4 kinds of epiphanic moments: the major upheaval, culminative, illuminative, relived, each meaning centers on the problematic. So it's, what I'm saying is, in terms of these educational life forms, you know, their use and their purpose and why we're doing it, and how Deleuze's philosophy can be applied, comes through these kind of epiphanies. So it's theory and practice come together, and suddenly, yes, oh, that's how it works. You know, epiphanies, lovely way of describing it. So in the book, I had a bit of fun with epiphanies, and I take some of my favourite theorists in the Deleuzian sphere to explain what they are. It's you know, one bit is the eternal return, again, because it's a time-based notion. So you can use the eternal return here as a bridging mechanism between the conceptual resources that one might bring to a problem, for example, the teacher working through and questioning their reasons and methods of engaging the students, and the practical consequences of the situation, just asking introspective questions and making pedagogic changes. So it's, you know, what I love about the eternal return, Klosowski talks about this really well, this declarative mood, the tonality of the soul. It brings, you know, you've got the future there, past here, and it's the moment. You're living for the moment. Time, again, a little bit using Bergson, becomes the most important thing you do. Again, epiphanies, really about time. Experience, another important part of epiphanies, that, you know, experience isn't this thing we, you know, impose on our teaching and learning practice. So there are levels to experience. There's a sort of, it's a disrupted experience. You know, you can ask penetrating questions, often in teaching. You know, it's just, people say it's all about experience. It's just about going in there and doing it and having the experience, and you'll know what to do. But epiphanies are kind of counter that in many ways. It's not, experience isn't a stable part of the experience of an epiphany. You know, it's often sort of breaking up one's presuppositions of what one should do. Okay? The virtual, next chapter is on the virtual. I start the chapter off by trying to understand what Deleuze was talking about when he's explaining the virtual. A lot of the material that I use in that chapter comes from difference and repetition. A big, chunky book, very interesting philosophically. 2 influences we've already mentioned here on the virtual, Bergson and Nietzsche. Again, you know, we don't want the, you know, virtue is obviously a type, it's something to do with thinking. It's about thinking, but again, it's not thinking as like experience, it's not stable. You know, you haven't got this beautiful picture of thinking as an ideal state which we should all be in, like philosophers, you know, sitting there like a Rodin sort of statue. It's, you know, it's turbulent, it's changeable, it's transformational. So the unconscious of Bergson is qualitative multiplicities, Bergson calls them. So they're hybrid. They're going in and out, changing all the time. They're interacting, attracting, convincing, incorporating. Never the same. It's the diagram that Deleuze takes in Bergsonism on Bergson's cone of the virtual. So here's now. This is the plane that, you know, where we're thinking now S, and here these are the virtual parts of the cone. And around there can be memory, can be imagination, can be thought, can be dreams. You know, the idea is to suck those down and use it. And so you get some movement. You get these ideas, these virtual ideas, actualizing. So it's, you know, it's highly unstable realm here, but on the plane of now, we can use them. We can do something with them. We can, you know, we can take things from the virtual and you know, make something in educational life forms. So that's kind of what I try and explain in the book. But towards the end of the chapter, I got a bit, you know, I was thinking about this, and it was all sounding really beautiful. The virtual, it sounds lovely. It's a type of thought, you know, we get kids to think in schools. And I just, towards the end, I thought, well, no, actually, I've got to critique this as well. You know, that Karl Marx is in here as well as an influence on the philosophy of life. The danger of being too philosophically intelligent and sensitive in a way is that outside influences then come and exploit you and use you. Capitalism being, you know, the main one. So I look at virtual reality, look at the virtual, look at, you know, this idea that society is becoming more virtual, and that bits of virtuality is all the good stuff which in education we should begin getting kids to do. So I don't want that. I want to be able to protect the virtual from capitalist exploitation. So I do a kind of automaton critique of schools producing virtual reality and virtual value at the end of that chapter as well. I think it's important not to just be innocently put these ideas like the virtual out there and think that, well, this is going to solve educational problems because it'll get kids to think better and improve on their abstract logic and stuff like that. Okay? Last couple of slides now. This is affect. Been looking at affect a lot over these last few years. What I do in the book is evolve this idea of a two-role model of affect. First role really relates to teaching, what it is to be a teacher, the identity of a teacher in front of a class or working with knowledge. And the second is the social cultural consequences of using language and power and being involved in education. So, you need both roles of affect to really understand how Deleuze's model of affect applies to education. It's not just all about the teacher and doing stuff with affect when you teach. It's also about, okay, what are the consequences of this knowledge? How does it work in a society? What's going on once the transmission of knowledge has happened? Affect, I think, is really interesting because it's pretty personal, kind of flows around everywhere. So you could say, we come into this space today, and before we're here, there already kind of affects to do with the institute, to do with the space, to do with the atmosphere in the society and all sorts of stuff. So language and power, when we're working with affect, we've got to take into account these non-human becomings, these things in between what we actually say and do as well. Okay, so in the book, I try and explain that in terms of a two-role model of affect. Again, Deleuze didn't like models, but in terms of trying to make it sort of chunky and concrete, I named it as a model. One part of it comes from Freud. A lot of people, so in London they were saying, he's not Freudian, he critiqued Freud, an anti-Oedipus, he does, anti-Oedipus, he's trying to not get an Oedipal contract when in society and stuff like that. But he also owes a lot to Freud. And certainly if we're talking with these unconscious effects when we speak, affect is coming through and things mean things that we don't know. Freud is the big name here. He was the analyst. So in the chapter I call that that's the part of the first role model of affect. So when you name something happens, someone tells you a story and you say, oh, that's because you feel anxious or you're depressed or whatever. So then naming the effect in your story, that's the first role. But and that role though there's a multiplicity there. In terms of Freud's analysis, is the ego and the super-ego. So it's not just one power over another power. There's an abundance there. There's multiplicity. There are things going on within that role which are interesting to look at as well. So I've got this is I analysed in terms of unconscious effect. Spinozism. Get back to Spinoza again. What I look at in this part of the chapter with this two-role model of effect are teaching manuals and criteria for becoming a professional in the teaching profession. And they're written in this objective, unbodily, this style of language, this professional style of language, as if nobody ever inhabits these ways of doing things. So what I do is take contemporary feminism, and ideas about the body, and I kind of spruce it up. I critique, basically, ideas of language and power, which says there's no body in ideas. And I think Spinoza, the affect from Spinoza, the plane of immanence, Deleuze calls it, that can create this disruptive element within these regulatory coded language things, which especially in education, but in any institute of teaching and learning, as if we're not bodies, at least as if we don't sweat or have any desire or anything like that. Okay, so in that section I just critique that. Okay, this is in the final chapter. So as I said, my job is I'm a teacher trainer, and my students all the time say, okay, that's brilliant, David, you've just told us about Deleuze and we love that, la la la, but how can we use it? What can we do with it? So this is just in terms of lesson planning. They're teaching high school English, use Frankenstein. So I said, right, in your lesson plans, put life, epiphanies, the virtual affect in there. So use these ideas from Deleuze, however much you understand them, however, what you take from them, and apply it to the way in which you treat Frankenstein in the lesson. So you just ask questions, so I just, this is a table from some student interaction I've had about teaching Frankenstein, and how they can relate these various sections. So again, I don't want to impose this on. I don't want to say, right, now you've got to do this in every lesson, every time you teach Frankenstein, because that's just me reproducing the power concerns, which we're questioning in many ways. But have these 4 elements in there to give you a balanced view of how to teach this great novel. And what it does is it opens up the field, gets them thinking about things like affect, epiphanies, the virtual life, and hopefully it should improve the teaching. Okay, last one then. Conclusion. This is a quote from Deleuze-Guattari. Read this one. The various forms of education or normalization, so they're saying education is just normalization, imposed upon an individual consist in making him or her change positions of subjectification, always moving towards a higher, nobler one, in closer conformity with the supposed ideal. Then from the point of subjectification issues a subject of enunciation, as a function of a mental reality determined by that point. From the subject of enunciation issues a subject of the statement. In other words, a subject bound to statements in conformity with a dominant reality. So, when I've given people this quote before, they said, oh, okay, we give up. We're not going to work in education because they've sort of said it all. It's just about normalization. It's just about turning us into these conforming with dominant realities. But no, for actually that quote and thinking about that and putting into the job that I do, which is teacher training, it actually gives me hope. It gives me this idea, well, hang on a minute, if we can theorize that, if we can understand that, if we can explain that, we can also get out of it. We can also do something different. We can also change our practice. So far from actually closing down options, I think this critique and this analysis, gives me an idea, gives me the inkling, gives me an epiphany maybe of a way out and an escape route and something new that I can do. Yeah.